I'm going to jump right into it. We're going to get rid of this temporary hollow track bar that we had on there, and we're going to put in this solid 4th gen unit, and this fits the bracket, the aftermarket bracket we put on in the last episode. The only difference is you need to open up your holes. So technically you could run an 18mm bolt and that would fit the track bar, but I chose to enlarge the track bar to 3/4 and our holes to 3/4. All right, now this is a fun one. So now we're going to replace our outer tie rod that we custom made on the last episode, and we're actually going to use the tie rod that comes with the Moog, so off-the-shelf tie rod. But instead, we're going to make a longer heavy-duty coupler. So this is basically a coupling nut. We're making that an 1.5" hex shaft, and I'm going to drill and tap it on either end for the 1" 16. So one's going to be one side will be left-hand thread, one side will be right-hand thread. This is going to be a jam nut style coupler here instead of the clamp style like the factory uses. Now I intentionally have this set up so that what's holding the tap there on the end is very weak, because if I needed a fusible link, because the lathe has so much torque and I'm going so slow, I wouldn't be able to stop it in time if things went haywire, and I needed something that would slip or possibly break that wasn't my tap or my part that I'm trying to make here. Now, when I bought this drill bit, I didn't really think about how deep I'm going, and it would have been nicer if I had bought a longer drill bit with longer flutes, because they actually start filling up, and so you have to get the chips out of there once you start getting real deep. Otherwise, you're going to start galling up your part that you're trying to make there. It's also not sharpened very good. It cuts mostly on one side, and the other side doesn't do very much, which means they didn't sharpen it when they sharpened it very centered. One side is longer than the other, so it does all its cutting off one edge of the drill bit, which also isn't very good. So that wasn't a very good drill bit, but it made the right size hole, and I guess in the end of the day, that's all that really mattered. So this is actually the left-hand thread, even though it looks like it's spinning right-hand thread. It's kind of odd how it does that, but this is the left-hand thread side. So I couldn't be happier with that. That turned out pretty good. We still need to deburr it. We'll do that here in a minute. Now we're going to make some coupling nuts, and I'm doing this separately because my drill bit wasn't long enough to where I could have just parted 2 ends off of the coupling nut, one off either end, and I would have had basically our jam nuts just already done. But since our drill bit was so short and everything, and I wasn't confident that we could get that much depth, I just decided to make these as separate pieces, and it was a fairly easy project to do it this way anyway. And now I'm just going to knock the edges off by hand instead of trying to do them on the lathe, because it takes too much of the point off and not any of the flat. So now we get to do the fun part, and that's just put it together. And everything worked out perfectly, all our measurements worked out, and our threads worked. So I guess we did a pretty good job there. Now the only thing I have to do is clean up the marks I just put in it. Oh well, it is what it is. But that turned out pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. That looks it looks good, and it obviously looks a little custom, but it looks burly. You don't have to really worry about that coupling nut. I don't think that's going to be the failure point in our steering system. Plus, this is a pretty good steering system anyway. This thing's going to drive pretty darn nice. So that track bar and the steering does get pretty close to each other, but they don't hit, and that's all that really matters. Now, if I were to design this myself, I believe we could make it so that track bar bracket would move that track bar back a little bit. I don't think it needs to be so far forward because everything gets close. You can see how close the Pitman arm gets and the steering, but none of it's hitting. And in the end of the day, that's all that really matters. Now, through the whole cycle, that doesn't hit. I've already done some flexing and stuff on it and doing investigations on that. So our top mount sway bar, that looks pretty good. That's down obviously as far as it can go since the vehicle's lifted. And then when you put the weight on it, that the ears on our sway bar level out a little bit. All right, guys, so we're going to swap out our non-serviceable unit bearing here with a manual hub style serviceable bearing kit. Again, from Yukon. We'll get into more of that later for those of you who follow along on the channel. Now, this is going to massively decrease the rolling resistance of the front end of this thing, which is basically free horsepower, as well as increasing the lifespan of all the components in the front end since we're not needlessly spinning them while driving around in two-wheel drive. Now, before we get going on that, check out my merch store. I'm doing a promo right now for 25% off. Use this code right here. That's going to be good through April 1st. Unlimited purchases, 25% off. Help support the channel by telling everyone all about it when they ask, what the hell is that? All right, so, and to be perfectly honest, doing these hub conversions, the hardest part doesn't have anything to do with the hub conversion. The hardest part's the same thing that you'll have to deal with just changing your unit bearing. That's the hardest part, is getting them apart. You know, I've had them where they come right apart, like on the 4x4 RV. Those bearings came out fairly easily, but on this one, man, they're stuck in there pretty good. I wouldn't say they're the worst I've ever had, but they were pretty bad, especially on the other side. The other side was much tighter than this one to get out. So you just got to do all the typical fighting. If the vehicle's running, you can use the power steering sometimes to figure out some way of pushing on the bolts to push it out. But in this situation, I just beat it out of there, and it was just fine to do it that way. I really should create some sort of a tool for this, but the problem is it'd be so vehicle specific. I just don't know if it'd be worth it. I mean, it really wasn't even worth it for me, but if it could save someone some time, and I have so many of these chassis laying around that it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to do that. But I always convert them to these manual hubs, which you'd think, now that we'll have serviceable bearings, eliminates you from ever having to do that again. But unfortunately, if you ever have to change your U-joints or anything with your axles, you still have to pull out the spindle. And the spindle's pressed in the same way, except you're not going to have the option of beating the crap out of it to get it off, because you have to reuse it again. So we might have to come up with something creative the next time we have to get one of those spindles out of there. So I'm going to go ahead and replace my ball joints since I'm in there, and I'm going to use my... I hate this ball joint puller. It's never once worked for me the way it's supposed to work. I can never orientate it the right direction because it doesn't come with enough sleeves and stuff to make it actually work the way it's supposed to. So I always have to do something goofy with it. So on the other side that we'll do here in just a second, I actually went and bought the Icon ball joint puller, and that works good. And it actually comes with the proper sleeves that even have the machined angle and everything in them, so we can do the ball joints a little easier. All right, well, here's a fun little trick. I've never actually tried this before, but I was going to try using, this is a tie rod pusher. It's for pushing out a tie rod. It technically would push on the stud of the tie rod to push it out. It actually works really good for you doing these U-joints. Now, if these were smaller U-joints, I think the ears on the puller would be too big, and you wouldn't be able to hook them on there without interfering with everything. But it actually worked really good for doing these joints on this one here. So there's an idea for you. You could always modify a set too to make the clamp on part a little smaller, so you can do smaller U-joints with it. But I'm going to keep trying that and keep using that on U-joints, and we'll see what its limitations actually are. But it pushed out these rusty ones pretty good. It wasn't too bad at all. Now you actually have to put this little shield on the axle you just put on there. It doesn't take much to get it on there. You don't need to beat the crap out of it. It should slip on there pretty easy. Now we just got to install the axle. I try not to drag it down the axle tube, so you don't want to put all that dirt and stuff in your diff. So always be careful when you're shoving those new axle shafts in. Those diff tubes are just full of junk, and you know it all sticks to the axle on its way in. So now we have to do the part where we're pressing that in there, just knowing that it's going to be a pain in the butt to get it back out. You know, if I were to design these, I think I'd put some very large threaded holes right in between the two sets of bolts on either side, one on either side, so that you can actually run a bolt in and press it back out. You know, and that way you can do it evenly on either side, because there's really nothing to grab or bang on these things to get them back out. And there's no threads or anything. Anyway, to get these out, if they get stuck, are going to be a bitch. And I'm just seeing that going into it. But so far I haven't had to take one out, but I can only imagine it's not going to be very easy if we have to. So now we just need to press our bearing races into the hubs. They don't come pre-pressed in, so you'll have to press the inner and the outer ones in on your own. I'm using the Icon kit, but the Icon kit doesn't have the right size for the outer bearing, so the smaller one. So I have another kit that I use that part for on the smaller race, and that's actually me leaving to go get my other set so that I can steal it out of it. I don't know why it is. I always buy these master sets. You buy the biggest set with the most variety, and they still don't have all the stuff you need. All right, and so now I, of course, tried to do 4 studs at a time, pressing the studs in these. And my press doesn't have enough oomph to do it, and that was that was annoying. Do 2 at a time or do 1 at a time, which is what I ended up doing. You know, I've had this press for a long time and upgraded it with the air over hydraulic, and it's nice. But man, I either need to go through this thing and make it more rigid, or just get a new press altogether, which is probably what I'm going to have to do eventually. Now, choose your method on how you like to pack bearings. I really like these little bearing packers like this one. They're very inexpensive. You just fill them up with a grease gun. But I always do it, you know, even though the grease is squirting through it on the first one, I like to get it out, rotate it around, and do it a few times before putting your bearing in. All right, on this side, I'm going to just whiz through it. And then on the next side, I'll try to slow down and answer more questions. But on this side, you just put your outer wheel bearing in. Then you're going to put your wheel bearing nut on. And then once you get the wheel bearing nut on, there's a little lock plate. Your inner wheel bearing nut has a pin on it, and that's going to be sticking out. Your lock plate has holes in it and a keyway. And so you'll have to adjust that inner nut to line up so the holes line up. And then you put your outer lock nut on, and that jams everything together so it can't move. Now your inner nut is what's doing your preload. So when you have to do adjustments to make those pins and the holes line up, you always want to err on the side of too loose, not too tight. All right, I have to slow the video way down here so you can see this part. This part is basically just so the spring doesn't ride on your bearing. It goes in legs down. So you rewind it a little bit if you missed that part. And then you put your spring in, and you can see on the very top side of that spring, it's actually sticking up, and it's fighting me getting our little piece of the hub in. Because that spring is up. So I'm trying to bend it down a little bit. So they screwed up a little bit when they made that. It doesn't really hurt anything. It's just a difficult to assemble. So once you get that thing in there, then you just snake this lock ring around. Those are fairly easy to get on and off. They're very easy with a pick. It doesn't take much. This outer ring is the same thing. I like this style versus like an E-clip style. This style is much easier. You just snake them around. They're a lot lighter, so you can just do them basically with just a light pick or a small screwdriver. So that's what you should look like. The two ears there, those, when you press those in, it's what disconnects the cog inside the hub. That's what actually does your disconnect. So when you're pushing on those, it's disconnected. In this state here where you're not pushing on them, it's engaged. So the axle is engaged right now. And then when you put your hub on, it'll push and you rotate it to free. It'll actually push those in, and that'll disconnect the cog on that hub. So just like that. So just make sure you're in the locked position. If you see here, I'm pointing at locked, and then line up the grooves with those that we were just talking about, those two lugs, and that way you're ensured that the arrow is pointing the right way, because you could install it 180 degrees off, and then your arrow will just not be relevant to the markings on the rest of the hub. So fairly easy, and it looks really cool. It looks way better than that factory unit bearing. Now these hubs, once you've done one set, these are going to be very familiar. If they're confusing to you right now because you've never done them before, that's fine, but you will get very familiar with the way those things work. Now I'm just going to put my rusty brakes back on. You know, sadly, these brakes only are like 1 year old, and they already look like that because I used to drive that truck around in the snow and stuff. This truck, this van, I won't be driving it in de-ice or anything. But for now, I'm just going to reuse these brakes. And on this setup, if this was a pre-99. And you had to press that rotor on from the backside, I would have replaced it. But since this one's just slip-on rotor and they're easy to change, I'm just going to go ahead and run these ones the way they are at. All right, so this next side is going to go super slick because we just did the other side. It tried to fight me a little bit, but I won. So we're going to just disconnect our brakes, get all that off of there, and then we'll start tackling the stupid unit bearing that really didn't want to come off. So I ended up drilling a hole in the wheel flange right next to the hub centric part, and then ran it straight into the outer knuckle. So there's really not much to push on there. So you can, but if you get it real close to that outer wheel flange or the wheel flange there, or the hub centric part, you can run that bolt in right next to the ear on the unit bearing, and there's a spot you can push on right there. So I just used a 1/2 bolt in the nut and just drove it out that way. And that worked out pretty good. I probably should have just started off doing it that way. They drill pretty easy. So I did leave a mark though. So I used a paint stripper wheel, not a grinding wheel. It's for paint stripper. And then I cleaned it up the rest of the way with a wire wheel. And then we have to file that part flat because I left a pretty good sized dent in there with that bolt. It was pretty stuck. All right, so now we get to try on our new Icon ball joint press. And on the bottom, it worked really good to do it this way using that setup. and that worked out slick. On the top, I could not find, they don't have anything that plugs the hole on the bottom of the clamp. So and there was nothing really that could press on it. So I just did it that way and pressed it out that way. And that worked out pretty slick. Now pressing it in is basically just the exact same thing in reverse. All right, now we're going to try our tie rod puller again. And that worked out pretty slick, but there was a couple times where I needed to tap it with a hammer to give it a little assistance. But otherwise it worked good. So on these U-joints, I like using the spicers, but you do have to pop one of the seals off to get them in there. They go right back on again, but they have a metal shielding on them. So they're not like a normal U-joint where they just have the rubber. These spicers are really good U-joints, and if you don't want to have to change it again, I would recommend them on something like this in this situation there. So I like them a lot. And then our little installer tool, tie rod tool, worked great for putting it back together. Now I should point out that there is some shims that come with this Yukon kit for the U-joints here. That's only used on the 3rd gen. You're not going to use those on the 2nd gen. All right, now we got to put our dust shield on there again. Don't try to drive it on too far. You're actually bottoming out on the bottom, so if you try to hammer that flat on the top side, it won't fit. Your rubber seal goes on there like that, and then there's a plastic thruster washer that goes down, bevel down. All right, now same deal. Try to install your axle without dragging it along the bottom of the axle tube. Now you got to grease this bearing on the inside of your spindle, and then there's a little rubber seal. It's easier if you push that on the shaft first and then put it where it goes. It's just rubber. It's fairly easy, and it goes lip in on that one. That's keeping grease in and not water out. Water out's the rubber seal that you put on your axle shaft itself. That's what keeps the water out of there. And now that you got that all anti-seized up, we're just going to go ahead and drive it home. I just went ahead and used their bolts to do it. They're long enough to drive that thing in there. Now we get the fun task of packing some bearings again. I'm doing a 2. I'll pack it, rotate it around, and then pack it again, and then just go ahead and install it. Then we just install the seal, just make it flush, and it should look just like that once you get it installed. And then you can go ahead and drop your bearing in there, but you're going to have to hold it in as you install the hub. All right, slide it in there, get the bearing started. I actually just used that pipe to press it on there the rest of the way. I wasn't hammering on it. I just used it for finger extensions. Now this is your inner nut, so you can see the pin there is pointing out. So this is what you're going to do your preload with that pin pointing out towards you. All right, so now you just drive that all the way down. And you're going to actually over tighten it. So I believe they said 90 foot-pounds in their manual, but double check the manual. Over tighten it, you spin it around. You're just making sure they're seated, and then you're going to loosen it back up, and then you'll tighten it back down. And I believe they have you at 20 foot-pounds then. Which seems a little tight, but you're going to have to adjust it because it's not going to line up with the holes. So just do your adjustment to a little bit loose. And then again, after we drive this for a little while, we'll double check that. Once you get your lock plate on and the pins in there, you can go ahead and drive the outer lock nut down and tighten that one up pretty good. That's what holds everything at your settings. So now there's a little spacer that you put in here. It's kind of a critical part, but it's just sloppy. And that's what I just put in there. It's just literally a little piece of tubing. Then goes in the base for our spring that keeps the spring from touching the wheel bearing. Then goes in the spring. And then you're going to put in your hub assembly. This comes together. It's actually 2 pieces, but you don't have to do anything with it. It just installs just like that. And then you put in your little snake ring around there to lock it in. Now, if you can't get to the groove, you need to just slide your axle shaft out a little bit. You can grab it by the U-joint. Then goes in your outer plate and the outer snake ring, so it should look just like that. Now, when you push on those fingers, you're disconnecting it, and that should move pretty easily. You should just be able to do it with your fingers. Everything will have a nice coating of grease on it, so you should make sure everything's greased. So this just gets messy. I grease this thing before you put it together. There's O-rings and everything else on it. So the grease will help hold the O-rings in place, and it'll also keep them from drying out on you, hopefully. These little Allen screws, they have a nylon washer on them, and that makes sure that water doesn't get in there into your bearing assembly. So those are fairly important, and they're very easy to lose, and you can't hear them if they bounce on the ground. So just keep track of those while you're doing it, and then just clean it up, and you're good to go. All right, so now one thing I need to point out, and I should have probably pointed this out earlier, I'm not running dust shields, and I'm not using the ABS. So the dust shields would install between the outer knuckle and this spindle adapter that bolts on and replaces that unit bearing. that would go in between there. But if you're also going to run the ABS, you have to modify that. And the directions are fairly clear on how to modify it. However, I've never done it, so I can't tell you for sure that the directions are any good, but I assume they are. Now, the other thing I want to point out is Yukon does not give you extra parts unless it's a part that would be omitted from a specific model. So all your extra parts, if you have extra parts, make sure that you didn't miss something, because there won't be an extra bolt, there won't be an extra washer or anything. If you have an extra one, most likely you missed it. I've never had them give me an extra one, but I've also never had them miss one or had been shorted by them either. So just something else to pay attention to on that, making sure you don't have extra parts, because especially when it comes to assembling the inside there, if you have some extra spacer or something, you don't know where it went, it means you probably missed it, and you need to put it in there. There's nothing in there that's just for fun. Everything has a purpose, so you need to make sure all the parts are used. All right, guys, I'm going to end this one on a public service announcement for the 94 to 99 spin free kits. They provide you with the wrong wheel studs, and unfortunately, I've tried approaching them twice about it, and both times I've been basically told I was stupid. So this is what they did, and I gave them all this information, but they accidentally spec'd out the 7500 GVW wheel stud, and that's what they provide you. Unfortunately, their kit only fits an 8800, and their thickness of their assembly, once you put the rotor on, is the same as the 8800. Therefore, the 7500 GVW wheel stud is way too short. I don't know how to get through to them, but they have a level of arrogance, gatekeeping, that is astounding. And that arrogance is a huge liability, and we need to get a hold of someone at Yukon that actually has some authority to put these people in their place, because you can't have people like that gatekeeping safety concerns like this, because that wheel stud is significantly too short. It does not pass any safety standards whatsoever once you put it in their assembly. So anyway, thanks for watching. Go ahead and clip this and send it to the right people. If you happen to know someone at Yukon who could get it to the right person, shoot it that way, and we'll see you on the next one.